everyone. Welcome to the Internet of Senses Sound podcast. My name is Tyler Heaton. I am a sound designer and researcher in the Spatial Technologies Applied Research and Training Center at Lethbridge College in Alberta, Canada, where I specialize in the implementation of spatial media and technology in immersive experience design. Today, we are joined by Larry Goldberg, and you have one of the greatest titles on your LinkedIn profile, an accessibility sensei, which I love, and a consultant now with nearly 40 years experience making media more accessible. And today we're going to talk about how we can improve the experience for all audiences, and we'll get into a bunch of different things around accessibility and sound. Thank you, Larry, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. That title was awarded to me. I didn't give it to myself by a good friend who I used to work with at TechCrunch. And I thought, oh, I'm going to use that for sure.
Absolutely. So we'll start with a bit of an introduction. You have a great depth of experience working in the area of accessibility in media. Can you talk a little bit about your background and how you found your passion for accessibility?
Yeah, I think maybe it found me by amazing randomness and luck, but I've had so much fun doing this for my whole career. So I'm very grateful that I've been able to play with these tools, meet all such amazing people. I came at this from a love of media, and by media, that meant Super 8 films when I was in high school. My mother got a camera for opening a bank account and gave it to me, and boy, that kicked everything off. Making my own films, experimental, radical films. I look at them today and I love them. They're so ahead of their times, let's say. And from there, every kind of new media I can get my hands on, quarter packs, half-inch video, three-quarter inch, and then we move into the world of digital. But I also love computers along the way, and I had a chance to play with some of the early ones. And this notion of where computers and video come together, embedding data in a video picture, was closed captioning, really one of the earliest ways of marrying the two technologies. And I always wanted to be in media. I moved to Boston, tried to get a job at WGBH Public Broadcasting, really the pinnacle of television production in the Boston area. And after working at it and submitting my resume over and over again, a position opened up at the Caption Center, the place that invented closed captioning for television, started at WGBH. And I knew what closed captioning was, studied it in college, again, embedding data in a TV picture. My job interview was, do you know what closed captioning is? Yes, you're hired. It was kind of obscure back then. It was kind of new. And that just led to meeting people in the deaf community and getting to know people with sensory disabilities. WGBH then invented audio description for blind people, department called the Descriptive Video Service. So then I was looking at how do you make visual media accessible to blind people? And I headed up that department as well at WGBH. Around that time, the digital forms of media were really taking over with DVDs and the internet. And I realized there's a gap here in terms of designing these technologies that really can serve all audiences. So again, somewhat by luck and scheming, we got a major grant to open up the National Center for Accessible Media and really took on the whole question of what standards are needed, what guidelines, what tools, what policies. And that was such an enriching time, so great to work with innovators in the field, inventing stuff, exploiting things, and then got involved in some federal law. And there have been a number of pieces of national legislation that have advanced the field. The TV Decoder Circuitry Act required closed captioning capability to be built into every TV set. That changed so much. The Telecom Act of '96 required all TV shows to be closed captioned. Wow, the market really grew at that point. And then this piece of legislation called the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, or the CVAA. One of the sponsors was my own Congressman Ed Markey, asked me to get involved in writing up some of the provisions that would be incorporated in the bill that would require media to be accessible. That bill passed, signed by President Obama in 2010. And at that time, the Federal Communications Commission asked me to chair a subcommittee to write the regs that go along with that law. That was a fascinating look into policy, working with the head of Disney Tech and ABC, a lot of advocates. And those regs were written in 18 months, were implemented, and that really opened the door wide and put a number of tech companies on notice. You folks need to redesign your technology to be fully accessible. One of those companies was Yahoo, who approached me and said, now you've done it. Now you've created a compliance situation for us. Would you like to come on board and help us figure out how we're going to do all this? And so after 29 years at WGBH in the nonprofit world, I jumped over to the for-profit world and found out the kind of impact you can have when you've got 800 million daily active users. One little change could make a huge difference. So spent 8 years at Yahoo, networking with internally, externally, with all the big tech companies, just creating these relationships left and right. And then left about almost 2 years now to start consulting with a bunch of startups. And of course, my requirement involved with AI, because how can you take a breath today without dealing with AI? And it's had a really interesting impact on the accessibility field as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that got on here for us to talk about later in our conversation, because I think you're absolutely right. You can't really look at the media world, or I think really any part of our daily experience now, without AI starting to be a part of that conversation. So I definitely want to get into how AI is factoring into accessibility in that world. I want to take a step back with closed captioning, because you mentioned that's where you got your start. It's really one of those things I think we take for granted in modern media. It's just something that's there. But what was it like in the early days? What kind of innovations did you have to get into to really advance closed captioning and make it something that becomes a standard, becomes a part of law, becomes something that we can expect and eventually take for granted?
Yeah, I love the pervasiveness of closed captioning today and how it's ubiquitous, because it sure wasn't like that in the early days. I think my job was CBO, Chief Begging Officer. And that's what our life was about, trying to get TV networks and producers to accept the fact that we wanted to put words up on the screen, getting their permission, of course, developing the technology to inject this data into the TV signal and create a secondary master that had the data in it. So it mean we had to step down a generation at the time. That was radical, because the quality of the image was really key. And then how do you distribute it nationally? So we had to twist a lot of arms. We had to be resilient. We had to wake up every day knowing it's going to be another battle. But people who are in this field, particularly the OG broadcasters, they kind of love this idea of taking this long-standing broadcast technology and enhancing it in this really interesting way. The idea a consumer could push a button on this external box and have the words appear on screen was kind of magical. And I think kicked off this whole notion of personalized media in so many ways. But we had to deal with encoding and embedding and the data transfer, authoring tools. We had to invent them. There wasn't any authoring tools to create captions. We created a version of WordPerfect that had time code in it. It was some crazy times. And PBS, of course, we were working for public broadcasting. They embraced it immediately as a part of their mission. Interestingly, both CBS and ABC came on board very quickly. They saw the benefits as well. So with these major commercial networks, things began to flow. Uh, Then we figured out how to put it onto a VHS tape, which was a unique situation. But all of it was about innovators and people who felt like adding a social benefit to the technology that they were creating in the business was something that enhanced their lives. And of course, working with deaf people and to see how that changed their experience and their interest in media, particularly deaf kids. The kids who grew up with closed captioning and the effect on their literacy skills was magical. Really it was a hockey stick curve in terms of exposure to language. And interestingly, people who were immigrants to the US and studying English as a second language would use closed captions to learn English rapidly. So all these benefits came together, helped significantly by the legislation that I discussed. And little by little, it grew and grew with the laws then requiring it and then transferring it to other platforms. We created a community of people who really said, yes, we're going to develop this. The first version of QuickTime from Apple supported captions, QuickTime 1.0, and so did Microsoft with their video player, the real networks. They all said yes, having text on the screen helps a lot. Search engine optimization by having text to search on. So the begging became more facilitating and befriending. And I think the love of technology really advanced it for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of interesting points that I want to touch on in that. So two things really. One is, the conversation with the deaf community, with the user group of this. I think it's such a great story about, kids and media and literacy. When you started doing captioning, what was that conversation like to really get the most out of the experience? Because I think that as people who can hear, we take for granted that we can hear both speech, but that we can read
Hmm.
context through sound is something that we don't really have to think about. But to be able to take what's happening on a screen, the audio portion of what's happening in a media, and turn that into text that gives the same experience, what was that process like for closed captioning in the early days to do that translation?
It was pretty fascinating because we really were founded by linguists, people who really knew deaf education, sign language, and the transfer of sign to English, which is very different. And we started off with a belief that, especially on programs for deaf kids, we needed to edit heavily. We needed to, I hate to use the term, dumb down the language that was being spoken on screen and slow it down because the perceived wisdom among educators of deaf kids at the time in the 70s and 80s was that they couldn't keep up. And so we spent a tremendous amount of time taking more complicated sentences and creating noun, subject, noun, verb, subject, just straight, very easily digestible language. And not long after I joined in, we were getting pushback from deaf parents, deaf educators, deaf policymakers who were saying, why are you editing so heavily? How are we ever going to learn the language when you keep changing what is being said to what you think deaf kids need? And I'll say today, it feels like it was overnight. We changed, and everyone in the business changed from heavily edited captions to verbatim, word for word. And first of all, hey, that's great. Look at how much less time we have to spend editing. That saved us time and money. But also the perception of why are we being paternalistic here? If a deaf kid has trouble understanding and comprehending, okay, rewind, watch again. It's a learning opportunity. And that has become the rule ever since. So our job translating what was being spoken became much more of almost a straight pipeline. Put on screen what is being said. And that became an interesting controversy when we started captioning some R-rated movies. We had some clients who said, even though that bad word was spoken, we want you to censor it in the captions. Oh, that was an interesting controversy. Shouldn't we be giving deaf people exactly the same thing that hearing people are getting? And to this day, you'll see that in automatic speech recognition. Some of those machine engines are tuned to replace the F word with F asterisk, 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 even though it's being spoken out loud. So the whole thing's come all the way around again. Now machines are censoring on the behalf of the people receiving it. But it was a great learning opportunity to better understand our job.
Mhm. No, that's fascinating. That idea of censorship and changing the message. I think that's something we don't really think about. That when you can't, either because you don't speak the language or you can't hear what's being said, that the message can be interpreted for you by somebody that doesn't have that same perspective or experience. And that's really interesting. Did you have members of the deaf community working in the actual process? I know that seems like a strange question because, if you can't hear it, how do you write it? But in the translation, did you have members of the deaf community working with you?
Yeah, from day one. In fact, much of this work was started by deaf people in the federal government. There was a commission on education of the deaf headed by a deaf professor named Frank Bowe. He was the one who pushed captioning so heavily. We were always guided. We always had advisory groups. We had staff members who were deaf. The diversity of deafness is also a wide range. So there's still people who have some hearing but need captions. And then today, everyone's watching captions and people with very good hearing. So yeah, we were always guided by the deaf community, and particularly this issue of censorship and verbatim absolutely was driven by the deaf community. And boy, can they spot errors when there were typos, when they could clearly tell that wasn't what they said. Oh, we would hear about it. So we had a long-standing, and every captioning company had long-standing advisory groups where these questions were explored. The verbatim question was chewed over by a lot of experts in the field, and we would sit and listen. There's an expression in the disability community, nothing about us without us. And this was the exemplar of that. If we're creating something for deaf people, we better be sure they're involved in the process.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great saying. So I want to explore moving from closed captioning and the focus on augmenting the audio portion of media to looking now more broadly at accessibility more generally or more broadly. This idea of using one sense to augment another sense is an interesting perspective or paradigm to approach media. What are your thoughts on accessibility sort of more broadly and the way that different senses play a role in opening up media to all audiences?
Yeah, it's so interesting when I've been in this field for a long time, and though involved with every possible kind of technology to make it accessible, I'm always coming back to media and senses. And when I was contacted by you folks at the Internet of Senses, I really began thinking of, well, what am I really doing? Am I making media accessible, or am I somehow transforming media from one sense to another? And because I'm a huge fan of Oliver Sacks and the work he did on synesthesia, people who see colors and taste images, I thought, oh, maybe my job is really as a person who manufactures synesthesia. And that really triggered all kinds of thoughts. But of course, taking images and turning them into audio, taking audio, turning it into text. What about the other senses? I've started creating this grid, this outline of 5 by 5 senses. Of course, many people argue there's a lot more than five, but this notion of, all right, what other ways do you turn one sound into another, or sound into haptics, into touch, which there are some interesting technologies around that. How do you use virtual reality for a blind person? I recently tried out the Apple Vision Pro, and of course told all my friends in the accessibility community about some of the amazing imagery, which, by the way, Apple built in descriptions for the blind into the images. But they said, but I'm a blind person. Is there any reason I really would want this? And I think that's a great conversation to have. And how do you navigate a virtual world that is full of these alternate senses? And then how should we involve smell and taste in transforming a song into something you taste? I don't have the answer to that one. I'm hoping someone who listens to this podcast does. But certainly haptics is very big around both people who have vision loss and hearing loss.
Yeah, absolutely. Within our in our touch podcast, we have a whole many conversations around haptics, and that's such an interesting technology that does blur that line between sound and touch. And so I agree, there's other places I think where we can blur the lines between senses and find whether it's a technology or a process that allows us to manufacture synesthesia, as you put it. As somebody who works in immersive media and virtual reality, I see virtual reality as a great place to explore these different ways of augmenting senses in media. Have you done much work in that space, or have you used VR as a tool?
Yeah. When the latest round of excitement around VR came out, and it's been a periodic experience, but when it really, even before Facebook became Meta, when we realized this is going to become part of our mainstream world, I put together a consortium that has now become something called XR Access, which you can find information about at xraccess.org, now housed at Cornell Tech in New York. And we gathered a bunch of people together and say, what are we going to do? This cannot be released into the mainstream as a completely inaccessible technology. And one of the first things clearly was, okay, captions. Where do you put captions in this 360-degree environment? That's the virtual reality, the augmented reality, like, Google Glass had captions hanging out in front of your face when it first came out. We had a great conversation among a working group from the World Wide Web Consortium on simple questions like, where should these captions appear? And this notion of, should they be headlocked? So when you look forward, the captions are right in front of you. When you turn your head, they travel with you. Can you relocate them? What if they're in your way? Can you move them out of the way? The Vision Pro actually jumps around as you turn your head. The captions move into that field of vision. That wasn't a done deal. We didn't really know what would be the best. And the sort of obvious answer became, well, why don't you let the user decide? Why don't you just make it under user control? Who I prefer it lower left. I prefer it behind me. I prefer it way up in the sky. Shouldn't be so hard. So that's where some of the early prototypes came out. Where do we put captions? And then how do you generate them? If it's something pre-produced, what if it's live? What if you are in a simulated environment with other people and they're speaking? Can you create automatic live captions there? How do you indicate who's speaking? Walk into a party, a virtual party. What if two people are speaking on the other side of the room and they're having a private conversation? Should you make a way of turning off the captions because they don't really want to be overheard? We created this concept of the cone of silence, where you could isolate a couple of people who say, we're having a private conversation here. Please don't generate captions. These kind of ideas were so interesting to track down. And some of them have actually started getting embedded into the latest VR technologies.
Mhm. It reminds me when you were talking about, the positioning of captions, there's a couple of Russian films, Day Watch and Night Watch, and their captioning actually is attached to the characters. As the characters move around the scene, the captioning is right next to the characters, which is, when you think about normal captioning being, in that lower third of the screen, you don't think about being able to quickly differentiate which character is speaking other than there's titling on that. And so now that we're moving into these ideas of real-time spatial captioning, can we start exploring that, attaching it to people, using color, using other kinds of representation on that to help people understand where is that coming from.
Yeah.
And then of course that issue of privacy is, a very important one, especially as we move into tools that can do it on the fly, real time in digital environments.
There was
um,
a great development at the University of Barcelona where, okay, you're in a 360 environment. Someone may be talking behind you. First of all, yeah, assigning colors definitely helps, or maybe even a little avatar, a little icon that shows the person. And they created a little compass. So that could appear in the lower corner of the screen, and you might see words in front of you, but you don't know where they're coming from. And the compass would point you to the left or to the right or behind you and say, if you turn around, you'll see the person who's talking. It's like, wow, that was a really interesting innovation.
Absolutely. And like many innovations, I think when we hear about it, it seems so simple.
Mm.
But when we're trying to address that problem, those things don't immediately pop out to us. And I mean, I guess that's why a novel innovation is difficult, is that it in hindsight, everything seems obvious. But when you're staring it in the face, it's a real challenge. Having gone through these years and these iterations of working with this different technology, what advice would you have for designers that are approaching these new mediums or even current mediums and looking to make them more accessible for people with different sense challenges?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it starts with talk to the people who are going to be your end users. You have to really be involved in how they're experiencing the world. Now, they're not going to tell you all the same thing. There's an expression of you've met one blind person, you've met one blind person. You're going to get a diversity of opinions about how the media should be transformed, but you got to start there. And of course, have a wide open mind. Just because captions are in a certain font on the lower center of a screen doesn't mean they always have to be that way. There's an orthodoxy. We've been doing this for a number of years. We shouldn't get stuck. There's all kinds of creative ways. There are people who are very big fans of poetic captioning, where you really are changing the words to be much more creative. Some people say, wait a minute, captioning's just for comprehension. Don't get all fancy on me. Maybe you can have two streams of captions, one that is much more creative. Maybe you go to AI and say, write me a caption the way Hunter Thompson might write it, or write one the way that your mother might speak to you. Right now, because it's very manual and very labor intensive, you're not going to have dozens of different kinds of captions or descriptions for blind people. But the technology will allow it. So, like, free your mind. The solutions can come from any direction.
Absolutely. Let's jump into this conversation around AI.
Hmm.
Where have you seen AI now moving into the accessibility space? And what are your thoughts on the capabilities of AI and maybe concerns around the use of AI?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much right in the middle zone of 50% benefit, 50% danger. And there are people who drift in either direction on that. Before we even called it AI, automatic speech recognition for captions had been around for a long time. And I was pretty solidly opposed to it. First of all, I was running a caption operation with a lot of people with a lot of jobs who cared deeply about quality and accuracy and never a typo and no latency and, frame accurate. Don't divide a noun from an adjective. I mean, all these rules. And then the first ASR came out, I guess the first time I really experienced was on YouTube, and it was kind of a mess. It was really not very good. And so I felt confident, like, no, this is 10 years away, and it's always going to be 10 years away. Well, look around you now. Not only is it everywhere, and of course, every video conferencing tool and a lot of other places, but also it's getting better, and the latency is really, really low, and it will still make mistakes on names. It'll still make mistakes on locations. AI for captioning really struggles with accents and people who have dysarthric speech. So it still is not there yet. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine from France, and the captions were horrible because his accent was so strong. Well, now the major tech companies have banded together on really trying to improve and sample a lot more different kinds of speech. So there's the rule for you when you're building your language models, really expand it to include not just what you consider the typical user, but all kinds of edge cases, because your AI will fail in all kinds of ways if you don't include the complete expansive nature of humans. Humans come in all types and sizes and flavors, and your model should be trained on all of them, or else you'll just keep seeing failure left and right. So AI has absolutely become pretty solid in the field of speech to text. We rely on it a lot, become very disruptive of the captioning companies, obviously. And they're trying to make a buck at this. And then, because of the great lack of image tagging online, what's known as alt text is a way of authoring web pages so that if you're a blind person using a screen reader, it'll tell you what is in the image. That was missing most of the time. Some companies then sprang up to facilitate the creation of alt text. And now the machines are doing a lot of it, and some of it okay, and some of it missing entirely in terms of context, in terms of what's the meaning of this image. You've got a dog on screen. You can't just say dog. Maybe you want to know what type of dog. Maybe you want to know that it's a dog that has an injury or is in danger or is a seeing eye dog. Well, the machines need to learn all of those parameters to give you that information in context. And then the next frontiers, since I mentioned audio description of movies and TV shows, it's a major leap forward to say that a machine AI could actually create descriptions of an entertainment film and time it in between the dialogue, because audio description doesn't step on dialogue, and actually tell you what are the key visual elements you need to understand the program. I guess I'll learn from my own history being a skeptic of ASR at first for captioning. I don't think the machines are going to do audio description on dynamic images anytime soon, but I think I better be prepared.
You make a couple of really good points there around context and understanding, and how it's not just about what is on screen, but the context of what is on screen. Your example of descriptive text for film, and your example of alt tags and alt text in web pages, that it's not just about what is there, but it's about the context and the story, and making sure that there is this equality between what one person experiences and what the next person experiences. Have you experienced a sort of good enough mentality in the accessibility world, or does it feel like most people are really truly striving for that equality of experience?
You'll get the good enough more on the content provider side than on the user side, though it's a pretty low bar to say, well, it's better than nothing. It's like, really, is that your parameter for success, better than nothing? But yeah, there's an engineer at YouTube who is deaf who did feel like better than nothing. And you sit there and you try to figure out what is it that they're saying. It's just so off. But without that, you don't get even a chance to understand it. I myself would wish that people would hold off a little bit before releasing something publicly that was better than nothing or good enough. If Google had waited another year or two, they would have had a tremendous jump in quality. But no, they put it out right away, and I guess that's, fail fast and break things as an attitude. But when the things you might be breaking are people with disabilities, I think maybe there's an argument for holding off a little bit until you achieve a certain level of quality, avoid the harm that you might be causing. A wonderful professor up in Canada named Yuta Treviranus says, when she talks about AI and people with disabilities rely on technology. Sometimes the technology is inside their bodies, pacemakers, prosthetics. You don't want to make some mistakes when you're using AI to control those technologies. So, you really have to think about the cases where you're applying AI to accessibility and think seriously about what's the downside. These red teams absolutely are essential, and I'm glad that's being talked about as essential for the rollout of AI, because people don't necessarily think about the downside right off the bat. When I was working at Yahoo, when we had an app that would fail, sometimes we'd do a postmortem. We would never do a premortem, like, what could this go wrong? How could we create some harm here? I think we need to do some premortems on the technology that's coming out today.
Yeah, it's that difference between design and redesign. And
Mm.
you talked earlier on about redesigning technologies and having to go to these tech companies and introducing a process or a step that they now have to adapt into their technology, something like VHS or broadcast, versus let's look at it ahead of time and see what we can do so that we're not backpedaling to you know reinvent this. As we look into the future, I mean, we've talked about AI as a tool and something that is, we know, going to be pervasive in not only our media, but in other aspects of our lives. What other kinds of things do you imagine coming into the future? I imagine as a consultant with startups, you
Mhm.
come across a lot of interesting stuff, and I imagine there's a lot of it you can't talk about. But how do you kind of see the future of accessibility evolving so that we do get that equality, not just in the media experience, but in the daily life
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah, there's a good friend that I work with at Yahoo who's now at Google, and he's very strongly supportive of the AR side instead of the VR side of what technology can do, so that you can adapt your environment while you're moving through it to give you added information, certainly wayfinding and directions, translating other people's languages. And the one that I'm spending a lot of time on lately is sign language. It's a new higher bar to create technologies that can actually turn speech into ASL or BSL in Britain or ISL in India, and do it in a way that incorporates all of the nuances of facial expressions, body movement, the human side of it. Now, there already are, and will certainly be more signing avatars that are better than what you saw in early video games, but they're not there yet. But the notion that you could on the fly live turn speech into sign, right now humans are doing it. There aren't enough humans to go around to do this. And yeah, there's a cost there. But we, in this company I'm working with called Sign Up, working on adding sign to TV shows and movies that are streamed. We really started off with a opposition to the notion of using sonic avatars. We just felt like we respected interpreters, we're amazed at the work they do. We want to make sure that their jobs are preserved. Many interpreters are deaf themselves, and they use a two-step process. And then it was quite clear somebody is going to do it. Maybe our ethics and focus on the humanity, maybe we should get involved too, but hopefully in a way that is not harmful. First, do no harm. So we're looking at that now, as many others are too, obviously guided by deaf people who sign and parents who sign to their deaf kids and interpreters to really understand if this is going to be used, particularly on informational media or educational as opposed to entertainment, because entertainment is still tougher to transform. But, a straight out CNN report that someone really would prefer to have sign, okay, maybe an avatar could do not a good enough job, but a great enough job. And I guess if somebody's going to do it, we hope it's someone who cares enough. And so we're taking a look at it.
I'm hearing a recurrent theme in your approach to accessibility of context, understanding, nuance, keeping that richness of the experience there rather than stripping it down to sort of the core components of that. In your experience, has there been a bidirectional exchange of nuance? Have you ever had a moment where you gained something from somebody, from whether it's descriptive video or captioning or sign interpreting, that you've maybe experienced a nuance that you wouldn't have picked up as a seeing or hearing person?
Yeah, it can be quite delightful when you get that experience. Today, the people who write descriptions of TV shows and movies, and you can watch it yourself on virtually any streaming service, go into the menus. either audio menu or accommodation menu. And the really great writers who write descriptions of what's going on, often I'm delighted. It's like, oh, I didn't notice that. Oh, yeah, that person's the same person as that person. So that always delights. And then on the tech side, there's a company that was founded a few years ago called Be My Eyes, and it was developed for blind people. And the notion is a sighted person could volunteer and enter their phone number into a database. If a blind person needed help reading a document, a prescription, seeing what's in the fridge, they could call up a volunteer, hold up their phone, and say, "Hey, could you tell me what's inside my fridge?" And it went nuts. Millions of volunteers signed up to help. Hundreds of thousands of blind people use it on a daily basis. And then OpenAI approached Be My Eyes and said, "Hey, how'd you like to work together and create Be My AI?" It's available today for free on Android and iOS, and it is astounding. You could take a picture of anything, and the description it will give you is some of the most amazingly detailed and interesting analysis of what the picture was, and a blind person could turn on their screen reader and hear this analysis. And then, this is a friend of mine who's blind, was a beta tester. He pointed it at his fridge and said, "What's in my fridge?" And it described, the mayo and the bread and a few cold cuts and some other things. And then he said, "What could I make with these ingredients?" And it gave him a recipe of the things he could cook from what it saw in his fridge. And it's like, oh, okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's such an incredible story to hear that kind of innovation coming out of a need from one community that can benefit all communities. And that's the great kind of stories to hear and see that cooperation and that collaboration between different groups. Are there any other organizations that you would recommend our listeners look into who might be interested in accessibility?
The field has blossomed tremendously, even just over the past 5 years. And I'm so glad to see so many great organizations springing up, both commercial and nonprofit. Of course, my former organization, the National Center for Accessible Media, is on top of this at WGBH. Out of Utah State, there's an organization called WebAIM that does an annual report on the state of the web on accessibility. Another great organization out of Austin, Texas called Knowbility, that's KNOWBILITY. They have some great outreach to startups, and they have an annual contest for accessibility. And then the commercial companies, we talked about alt text. One startup I'm working with is called Scribely, Scribely. And they started to fill the gap around missing alt text. And they set up a service, and you can send in your images. They'll have people do a really great job. And of course, they were disrupted immediately by AI. So now they're incorporating AI into their work processes. So if you look at Scribely, you'll learn a lot about this whole question of image recognition, human-based and AI-based. And they're doing great work too. There's some annual conferences that are full of the people who are doing the cutting edge work. One is coming up. Well, we'll be podcasting this in March, and it's in mid-March. Everyone calls it CSUN, CSUN, sponsored by Cal State Northridge Technology for People with Disabilities, and it's been going on for 30 years. Another one called M-Enabling, every October in DC. All the companies, the nonprofits, the users come together. Great sessions come out. And then an online conference for free called Sight Tech Global as a fundraiser for the Vista Center for the Blind and Visually Impaired in the Bay Area. And they do an annual conference that focuses mostly on blindness issues. They get most amazing technologists, innovators, and entrepreneurs to do talks online. They're all right now available for the past 3 years now. That'll be coming up again this December. And it came out of a friend of mine who was executive producer at TechCrunch, which is part of Yahoo, whose wife is blind. And he decided, I'm going to use all my TechCrunch connections and bring some really sharp people together to talk about the cutting edge of accessible technology. So there's a lot out there, that's for sure.
What's the reaction like in these communities from your experience when these different technologies enter the market? Is there an openness? Is there resistance? Is there a mix of both within the community?
Yes, yes, and yes. The full range. Skepticism, for sure. You're just exploiting me because I'm a disabled person. Yep. And then let's be cautious and skeptical. Sure, I'm kind of in the middle. And then there's this rampant enthusiasm of, oh, we're going to make some mistakes, but let's charge forward. And it's like, uh-oh. But I guess that attitude's needed as well. And in the disability community, we've always embraced technology innovation. We rely on technology. I'm saying we because I use hearing aids, which, by the way, needs definitely some tech upgrades. But we know technology can be harnessed and exploited. The hesitance is some of this new stuff comes out that isn't built with accessibility built in. The word born accessible is a great meme. And retrofitting is just inefficient and inappropriate. Do I really have to wait for the third generation for this thing to work for me? I think most of the concern in the disability community is, did you build in accessibility on this cool new tech? And then also, okay, now let me see how I can exploit it.
This has been a really rich conversation. I've really enjoyed learning from your experience. I know our listeners
Mm.
will really gain a lot from this conversation. I thank you so much for being with us today and for the great work that you're doing. It's inspiring, and I hope that our listeners seek out these organizations and really try and uphold that born accessible mindset when approaching new technology, new design, and just new ways of finding processes and improving daily life. Thank you so much, Larry, and I wish you all
I,
the best.
I appreciate being asked. As you can tell, I could talk about this stuff for hours and hours. I love it. I'm on LinkedIn, so you can certainly find me there. And yeah, I am so excited about what's coming next. So really glad you're helping get the word out.